All right, ready to dive into this chapter on immediate memory and attention.
Absolutely, it's a fascinating one.
Yeah, just reading the intro had me thinking about all those times I'm trying to focus, but my brain decides to take a vacation.
Oh yeah, totally relatable. This chapter really gets into the science behind why staying focused can be such a struggle.
So before we get lost in the memory maze, let's start with the basics. The chapter keeps mentioning this thing called executive attention. What is that exactly?
Well, think of executive attention like the control center in your brain.
Okay.
It's constantly directing traffic between your thoughts, your senses, and your actions. It helps you prioritize what's important and filter out all those distractions that bombard you every second.
So like a mental air traffic controller making sure everything lands safely.
Exactly. And a key part of that whole process is something called inhibition, which is basically your brain's ability to hit the mute button on irrelevant information. Like imagine you're trying to have a conversation in a really noisy coffee shop.
Oh, I know the feeling.
Your executive attention is working overtime to filter out all that background chatter and focus on the person you're talking to.
Makes sense, but we all know those distractions can sneak through sometimes, right? Like when you're at a party, deep in conversation, and suddenly you hear your name across the room.
Ah, yes, the classic cocktail party effect. It's a perfect example of how our attention isn't always as selective as we think. Something as simple as a familiar sound can just hijack our focus, even when we're trying our best to ignore it.
It's like our brains have this secret radar for anything personally relevant. But is it just names, or can other things trigger this too?
Oh, absolutely. The chapter talks about the Stroop task, where you have to name the color of a word, but the word itself spells out a different color.
Oh yeah, I remember trying that. It's like so hard.
It is. It's incredibly difficult because our brains automatically process the word's meaning, even if we're trying to focus on the color.
So what does that tell us about our attention? Like, are we just doomed to be distracted?
Well, it highlights that our attentional resources are limited.
Okay.
We can only double so much information at once before things start to slip, and what's really interesting is that people with strong attention control, they're actually less susceptible to these effects. It's like their mental air traffic controllers are just better at keeping things organized.
So some people are just naturally better at focusing? Is that what you're saying?
It seems that way, but the chapter also suggests that we can train our attention at least to some extent. Things like mindfulness and meditation can help.
Okay, that's good to know. So we're not completely at the mercy of our easily distracted brains.
Exactly. But speaking of limitations, let's shift gears to immediate memory,
Okay.
which is essentially your brain's mental workspace, the place where you hold information online while you're actively using it.
So it's like the RAM of our brains, the temporary storage where we process everything that's happening right now.
Perfect analogy. But just like a computer's RAM, our immediate memory also has a limited capacity. You can only keep so many tabs open in your mind before things start to crash.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. Our brains sound a lot like my old laptop, constantly running out of memory. How limited are we talking, though? The chapter mentions this magic number 7.
Right. The classic idea was that we can hold around 7 plus or minus 2 items in immediate memory. But more recent research suggests it's actually closer to 3 or 4 chunks of information.
Chunks. Is that like grouping things together to remember them better? Like instead of remembering a string of random numbers, you chunk them into a phone number format?
Exactly. Chunking is a super powerful strategy for expanding the capacity of our immediate memory. Think about how we remember long strings of information, like credit card numbers or historical dates. We break them down into smaller, meaningful units that are easier to manage.
So it's all about organization, making connections. It seems like our brains really love patterns and meaning.
Oh, they absolutely do. And when it comes to immediate memory, it's not just about how much we can store, but also how we code the information.
Coding, like translating it into a language our brains understand.
Precisely. The chapter highlights 2 main types of coding, auditory and visuo-spatial.
So are we talking about our inner voice and inner eye? Like I can hear myself repeating a phone number in my head, but I can also picture a map to visualize a route?
Exactly. While research suggests that auditory coding, that inner voice, might be dominant for most people, we definitely also use visual and spatial coding to represent information in our minds.
This is making me realize just how complex even simple mental tasks are. Our brains are juggling so much behind the scenes. But this brings up a question. If we're using both visual and auditory coding, do they ever clash? Like, can they interfere with each other?
That's a great question, and it leads us to a fascinating study from 1968 by a researcher named Brooks. He asked participants to mentally scan a block letter F and indicate whether each corner was at the top or bottom.
Okay.
At the same time, they had to either point to a corresponding yes or no on a sheet of paper or say yes or no out loud.
Okay, that sounds like a mental workout.
It was, and the study showed that when the task involved the same mode of processing, visual and spatial, in this case, people struggled significantly more.
So our brains are better at handling different types of information simultaneously, as opposed to two things that use the same mental space.
Precisely. It highlights how important it is to understand how our cognitive resources are allocated and how different mental processes can interfere with each other.
This is all incredibly insightful, but how do researchers actually explain how this mental workspace operates? Are there any models or frameworks that try to capture all this complexity?
There are actually two main theoretical frameworks that try to explain how immediate memory works, and they offer some pretty contrasting perspectives.
Two competing theories. Now, this is where things get interesting. Tell me more.
Well, the first one you'll encounter in the chapter is called the modal model. It envisions memory as this three-stage assembly line.
Okay.
Information moves from sensory memory to short-term memory and finally to long-term memory.
So, like a factory with raw materials coming in, getting processed, and then either stored to the warehouse or discarded.
Exactly. But while this model provides a useful framework, it's probably a bit too simplistic to capture the dynamic nature of immediate memory.
So there's a more nuanced theory out there.
There is. The chapter also delves into Baddeley's working memory model.
Okay.
It proposes a multi-component system. Think of it like a team of specialists all working together, each with their own expertise.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Who are these memory specialists?
Well, first up, you've got the phonological loop. This one handles all things verbal. It's like that inner voice we were talking about earlier, rehearsing information to keep it fresh in our minds.
Right, that makes sense. What else is on this memory dream team?
Then there's the visuo-spatial sketchpad, which handles all things visual and spatial. It's what lets you mentally rotate objects, navigate a room, or remember the layout of a city.
So we've got one for words and one for pictures. This is starting to feel like a well-organized mental office. But who's the manager calling the shots?
That would be the central executive, the boss of this whole operation. It's responsible for allocating resources, switching between tasks, and basically keeping everything running smoothly.
Sounds like a tough job. Anyone else on this team?
There's one more key player, a relatively new addition to the team actually, called the episodic buffer. It acts as a bridge between working memory and long-term memory, helping to integrate different types of information and create a more cohesive experience.
Okay, so this model is like a finely tuned machine with all these different parts working together seamlessly. But wait, you mentioned earlier that even this model is being challenged.
That's right. There's another perspective called the unitary view of memory,
Okay.
which suggests that immediate memory isn't actually a separate system, but rather just the activated part of long-term memory.
Whoa, so instead of separate compartments, it's more like a spotlight shining on certain parts of our long-term memory, bringing them into our conscious awareness.
Exactly. It's a really fascinating debate, and researchers are still trying to piece together the whole puzzle of how memory really works.
Well, it definitely seems like there's more to memory than meets the eye. But while we're on the topic of limitations, what about forgetting? We all experience it, and it can be so frustrating. What are the main culprits behind those missing memories?
Researchers have identified two primary suspects: decay and interference. Decay is the simple idea that memories fade over time,
Oh, okay.
like a footprint in the sand slowly disappearing.
So the longer we go without accessing a memory, the harder it becomes to retrieve it. Out of sight, out of mind.
That's the basic idea. But while decay seems straightforward, it doesn't tell the whole story.
So there's more to it than just time passing.
Right. The other prime suspect is interference.
Okay.
This is the idea that new information can kind of muscle out old information, making retrieval more difficult. Think about studying for multiple exams in a short period.
Well, tell me about it. It's like the information from one exam is constantly battling for space with the information from another, a total mental free-for-all.
Exactly, that's interference in action. And there are actually two types: proactive interference, where old information interferes with new information, and retroactive interference, where new information interferes with old.
So it's a two-way street. Old memories can block new ones, and new memories can block old ones.
Precisely. Interference is a constant challenge for our memory systems, and it's a big reason why we sometimes struggle to remember things. But let's shift gears back to executive control for a moment. We've talked about how it helps us focus, but what happens when our mental air traffic controller has a rough day?
So our executive control, that mental air traffic controller, isn't always perfect. What are some things that can throw it off?
Well, one common culprit is mind wandering. Our minds just tend to drift off task surprisingly often, especially when we're engaged in something that doesn't really require our full attention.
You mean like zoning out during a boring meeting? I'm definitely guilty of that.
We've all been there. Research actually suggests that mind wandering is more likely when tasks are undemanding, allowing our inner thoughts to kind of hijack our attention. It's like our brains have this built-in screensaver that kicks in when we're on autopilot.
So if I'm reading a dense research paper, my mind might decide to start planning my next vacation.
Exactly. It's the central executive job to keep those thoughts in check, but sometimes those inner distractions can be pretty persuasive. And here's a thought-provoking question. Have you noticed your mind wandering at all while listening to this deep dive?
Okay, you got me there. But in my defense, this stuff is pretty fascinating. It's hard not to let my mind wander off on tangents sometimes.
I completely understand. It's all part of how our brains work. Now, mind wandering is one thing, but there are other more ironic challenges to executive control.
Ironic. That sounds intriguing. What do you mean?
Well, have you ever noticed how trying not to think about something can actually make it more likely to pop into your head?
Oh, absolutely. Like when I'm trying to fall asleep and I tell myself, don't think about work, don't think about work, and guess what? Work is all I can think about.
That's the irony of mental control. It's actually known as Wegener's theory of ironic processes of control. Essentially, when we try to suppress a thought, especially under stress, it can become more prominent in our minds.
So the more I try to fight it, the stronger it gets, like a mental boomerang.
Exactly. The chapter gives a great example from a golf putting study. Participants were told to focus on not overshooting the target, and guess what happened?
They overshot it.
You got it. Their attempts to suppress the thought of overshooting actually made them more likely to do it. It's a fascinating paradox of mental control.
Okay, so trying too hard to control our thoughts can backfire. It's like a mental tug of war we can't win. But what about stress? We all know that stress can do a number on our brains, but how does it actually impact our immediate memory and decision-making?
Well, various forms of stress deadlines, pressure, even the thrill of skydiving can impair cognitive abilities. Remember that study mentioned in the chapter where they tested the immediate memory of parachutists right before and after a jump?
The skydiving study, yes, that one was wild.
It was, and they found that even experienced skydivers, they showed a significant drop in immediate memory capacity right before a jump, highlighting the impact of stress on our mental agility.
That's understandable. I can only imagine the adrenaline rush and pressure they must be feeling. But it's not just extreme situations like skydiving, right? What about everyday stress?
Exactly. Chronic stress, like the kind that comes with a demanding job or financial worries, can also have a detrimental effect on our immediate memory and cognitive performance. The chapter mentions the concept of allostatic load, which basically refers to the wear and tear on the body caused by prolonged exposure to stress.
So the constant strain of dealing with difficult life circumstances can actually impact brain function.
Precisely. Research has shown a really strong link between chronic stress and impaired immediate memory. It highlights the profound impact that our environment and lifestyle can have on our cognitive abilities.
This is all pretty sobering. It seems like our executive control, our mental air traffic controller, is under constant attack from distractions, ironic processes, and stress. But is there anything we can do to improve our executive function? Can we train our brains to be better multitaskers?
That's a question a lot of researchers are exploring, and the answers might surprise you. The chapter discusses a study that compared heavy multitaskers, people who are constantly juggling multiple media streams, with those who multitask less frequently.
I have a feeling I know where this is going.
The study found that the heavy multitaskers actually performed worse on attention and memory tests. Their constant juggling act didn't make them mental ninjas. It actually seemed to make them less focused.
Wow, so all that multitasking might be doing more harm than good.
It's a real possibility, and it raises a really important question. Does our constant exposure to information overload and the temptation to multitask actually make us less able to concentrate and focus in the long run?
It's definitely something to think about. I mean, most of us are guilty of checking our phones while watching TV or trying to answer emails while cooking dinner. But if all this multitasking is actually weakening our attention muscles, that's a bit concerning.
It is, and it suggests that maybe we need to be more mindful of how we manage our attention. Maybe it's time to put down the phone, close those extra tabs, and give our brains a chance to focus on one thing at a time.
So it sounds like the key to a sharper mind might actually be doing less, not more. But as we wrap up this deep dive into immediate memory and attention, what's the big takeaway here? What should we all be walking away with?
I think the main point is this. Our brains have these amazing capabilities, but they're also surprisingly limited in how much information they can actually handle at once. We're not mental superheroes, we can't effortlessly multitask and remember everything.
Right, we need to be realistic about our mental bandwidth and find strategies to work with our limitations, not against them.
Absolutely. And the good news is there are tons of techniques we can use to improve our focus, memory, and attention. Everything from simple strategies like chunking to more holistic approaches like mindfulness and stress management.
So it's not about becoming some kind of memory savant. It's more about understanding how our brains work and finding ways to optimize them.
Exactly. It's like any complex system, you need to know how to use it properly if you want the best results.
Well said. Speaking of optimizing our brains, what are some of the most effective things people can do to boost their memory and attention in everyday life?
Well, one of the simplest and most effective techniques is chunking, which we talked about earlier. It's basically about grouping information into meaningful units so it's easier to remember. Like instead of trying to remember a random string of numbers, you chunk them together into a phone number format.
Right. It's like turning a long grocery list into categories: produce, dairy, snacks. That makes total sense. Are there any other simple tricks like that?
Definitely. Another really powerful technique is visualization. So when you're trying to remember something, try to create a really vivid mental image of it in your mind. And the more senses you can involve, the better. So, for example, if you're trying to remember a new person's name, try picturing their face, hearing their voice, even imagine shaking their hand. It'll help create a much stronger memory trace in your brain.
Okay, so chunking and visualization, those are two great starting points. But what about the bigger picture? Like, how can we create an environment that actually supports our cognitive function?
That's a crucial aspect of optimizing your brain power. One of the most important thing is to manage stress levels. When you're chronically stressed, your brain is basically in fight or flight mode, which makes it really hard to focus or learn new things.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like trying to study for a test while a bear is chasing you. Not very effective. So what are some good ways to de-stress and give our brains a break?
There are tons of great options out there. Exercise is one of the best stress busters. It releases endorphins, which have mood-boosting effects, and it helps clear your head. Mindfulness practices like meditation and yoga can also be incredibly helpful. They teach you how to observe your thoughts and emotions without judgment, which can really reduce anxiety and improve your focus.
Those are all great suggestions. And of course, we can't forget about the importance of sleep. I know I'm definitely not at my best when I'm running on fumes.
Sleep is absolutely crucial for cognitive function. When you sleep, your brain is busy consolidating memories, clearing out toxins, and basically preparing for the day ahead. So if you're not getting enough sleep, your mental performance is definitely going to suffer.
Okay, so manage stress, get enough sleep, exercise, practice mindfulness. It sounds like a recipe for a healthy brain. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to that mind-blowing question you posed earlier about consciousness and its connection to memory.
Ah, yes, the ultimate mystery. It is fascinating to think that our conscious experience might just be the result of certain memories being activated at any given moment, like a spotlight shining on different parts of our mental landscape.
It's a truly humbling thought. It makes you realize that what we perceive as reality is just a tiny fraction of what's actually going on in our brains.
Exactly. And the more we learn about memory, the more we realize how much we don't know. There are still so many unanswered questions about how our brains create, store, and retrieve memories, and how all of that relates to our conscious experience.
It's exciting and a little bit daunting at the same time. But I guess that's the beauty of science. There's always something new to discover.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great note to end on. Keep asking questions, keep exploring, and never stop being curious about the incredible world of the human mind.
Well said. And on that note, we want to thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into immediate memory and attention. We hope you learned something new and that you'll continue to explore the fascinating world of cognitive science.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure diving deep with you.
Until next time, deep divers. Keep those brains engaged.